Christmas Day, 1942. Guadalcanal. A Japanese non-commissioned officer, a sergeant, starving, shaking with malaria fever, pressed his pencil to the page and wrote these words. Artillery bombardment is a terrible thing. He had expected a fight. He had expected hunger. He had expected to die, if the emperor required it. He had not expected this. The sound, coming without warning, in great numbers, on a day the enemy called holy. That is the open question sitting at the center of this story. Not how the Americans fought, but what it did to the men inside the Japanese lines, and what they finally admitted about it. Tonight we go inside. Before the artillery found them, the Japanese soldier believed he already knew the answer. The military culture that shaped every man who wore the imperial uniform rested on a specific idea. That spiritual force, will, the willingness to die for the emperor, could overcome any material disadvantage. This was not merely propaganda told to young men before shipping out. It was a doctrine embedded in training, in field manuals, in the very way an officer addressed his troops. Japan's army had won wars against Russia in 1905, fighting with this conviction. The men believed it the way they believed in gravity, as something not requiring proof. And so when Japanese soldiers arrived on the islands of the Pacific, they carried that belief the way they carried their rifles. They had heard that American troops were soft, raised in comfort, unprepared for the hardness of real soldiers. A Japanese platoon leader, probational officer Toshihiro Ora, posted near the Munda Point airfield on the southwest tip of New Georgia in the Solomon Islands, wrote in his diary in late June 1943, with the quiet confidence of a man who has already decided how the war will end. I have become used to combat, and I have no fear. He was certain. His belief in his own invincibility, he wrote, was at last high. Imagine what he saw, those first days. American ships on the horizon, landing craft in great numbers. The ratio looked wrong, but officers were trained to read wrong ratios with courage, not arithmetic. On June 30, 1943, he noted 4 cruisers, 2 destroyers, 2 transports, and what he called countless boats off Rendova Island. He watched, he recorded, he remained calm. The Japanese military creed told him that spirit conquers steel. He would be proved wrong within days. But before the collapse, there was that window of belief, and inside it, something that makes these men human. Ara thought about hot springs. He lay in the sand and pulled out a travel handbook his father had bought him, now torn by shrapnel, and he looked at the map of his homeland and felt something that anyone who has ever been far from home will recognize. He just wanted to go back. But that is where the gentleness ends. July 2nd, 1943. Ora's diary begins to change. A single American cruiser, one ship, began shelling his position. Ora wrote plainly, "I was scared to death." He crouched to light a cigarette, and the shells came in before he could stand back up. He wrote about stray rounds falling within 5 meters of his shelter. He noted the enemy's guns were 150 millimeters. He thought 150. They were actually 155 millimeters, American M1 howitzers, and the precision of those rounds was, by his own reckoning, a real thing. He could hear the artillery change from distant to close, feel the compression in the air, and he wrote that he could never tell when he was going to die. This is the first documented crack, not in courage, but in certainty. Ora did not stop fighting. He did not run, but the confidence in his opening entries was gone, replaced by something more honest and more frightening. The recognition that the enemy's firepower was operating on a different scale than anything his training had prepared him for. By July 11th, he wrote that the enemy had fired at least 2,000 rounds in a single day. Some hit within 5 meters of his shelter. His gun positions were being dismantled, piece by piece, from a distance he could not reach. He was losing guns without being able to fire back. Then he wrote something that reads like the beginning of a confession. "I must say that there is close cooperation between the enemy's air, land, and naval forces." Ura recorded in his diary. Ura forces have not carried out a large-scale bombing. They haven't shelled Rendova with a single battleship, nor have they given the army any heavy artillery pieces. He paused. You can feel it between the lines. And then he wrote, "What do you call this? How could such action be called modern war? The man who had opened his diary certain of Japanese invincibility closed an entry admitting they were fighting with rifles and bayonets against aircraft, battleships, and medium artillery. The Japanese army, he wrote, is still depending on the hand-to-hand fighting of the Meiji era, while the enemy is using highly developed scientific weapons. That sentence was written in July 1943. Ara's fate is unknown. It is unlikely he survived, but his words survived. And the men on Guadalcanal had already been writing the same things. Return now to that Christmas day, December 25, 1942, back to the man whose line opened this story. The diary was one of 3 captured Japanese journals translated by the G2 intelligence section of the 14th Corps. The writers were Japanese soldiers of the Nagoya Division, the last Japanese force committed to Guadalcanal. They had taken to calling the island Starvation Island, a pun built from the Japanese phoneme ga, meaning hunger. They had been there for months. The anonymous, non-commissioned officer wrote on December 25th, "Today is Christmas, a very important day for the enemy. Artillery bombardment is a terrible thing. Again, I became sick with malaria, and my temperature began to rise, so I fell asleep in the trench." 6 words. Artillery bombardment is a terrible thing. The sentence holds the weight of a man with fever in a trench, listening to rounds he cannot answer. An unknown Japanese soldier in the same unit wrote that same day that the men had received many presents from the enemy, such as intense bombardment by artillery and naval guns, and then added, with bitter clarity, that not a single friendly aircraft had appeared. The men in the front lines, he noted, had become so disgusted they did not even talk about their own planes anymore. By January 1, 1943, the same NCO, now drinking a small measure of whiskey someone had carried up to the line, wrote a toast for the emperor, and then added, almost as an aside, "It is surprising how many shells the enemy has." That is the sentence. That is the moment. Not an analysis, not a formal military assessment. Just a man, sick and shivering, raising a cup in a jungle trench and noting with naked surprise that the Americans had more ammunition than he could have imagined possible. By January 11th, the officer named Okajima, whose diary is the 3rd voice in these journals, wrote his final entry. By artillery fire, 3 more were killed and 4 wounded. It is too much to receive naval bombardment also. He made no entry after that day. Hit subscribe right now, because what a Japanese general admitted in his final radio message changes everything about how we understand this war. Do not go anywhere. The Japanese military drew its lesson from Guadalcanal and the Solomons. If American artillery could not be countered above ground, it had to be negated below it. The new doctrine was built by men who had watched the old doctrine fail. By 1944, this shift had taken physical form on the island of Peleliu. Colonel Kunio Nakagawa commanded the Japanese defenders there. He abandoned the traditional banzai charge, the massed frontal assault that faith in spiritual superiority had always demanded, and instead constructed a network of fortifications connected by tunnels, built into the natural limestone geography of the island. His men would absorb the American bombardment underground, then emerge and fight from concealment. The tunnel became the Japanese answer to the artillery. And on Iwo Jima, the answer reached its fullest expression. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi oversaw the construction of 18 kilometers of tunnels beneath the volcanic island, a network of bunkers and connected passages that allowed his garrison to survive pre-invasion bombardments that would have obliterated any force fighting in the open. When the Americans landed on February 19, 1945, Japanese defenders emerged from the earth after the shelling passed and took their positions. Kuribayashi is one of the most remarkable figures in this story, because he knew, before a single round was fired on Iwo Jima, precisely what his men were going to face. He had traveled to the United States in 1928, attached to the Japanese embassy, and spent time observing American industry, American roads, American factories. He wrote to his wife about what he saw. "The United States," he told her, "is the last country in the world we should fight." He repeated the sentiment more than once. He was ignored by the decision-makers in Tokyo, and so, years later, he was given command of an island and ordered to hold it. Remember what he believed at the start? Here is where it breaks. The tunnel doctrine worked, partially. The garrison at Peleliu, under Nakagawa, inflicted enormous American casualties. At Iwo Jima, Kuribayashi's men held the island for 36 days against a force that vastly outnumbered and outgunned them. But the artillery did not stop. It could not be beaten. It could only be endured. An unknown Japanese soldier on Iwo Jima kept a diary between January 1 and March 25, 1945. That diary was translated and preserved, recovered from the battlefield. It chronicles battle preparations and then the invasion itself, the sensation of going underground while the bombardment passed overhead, and then the emergence into a changed world. Some entries were removed by military intelligence. The entries that remain describe a man waiting, underground, while the sound of American guns worked the surface above him. We do not know his name. The diary stopped. On Okinawa, the last great island battle, the scale of American artillery became something that even those who had trained for it could not quite process. The 10th Army fired 1.1 million 105mm howitzer rounds during that battle. The Navy added some 600,000 rounds from offshore guns. The ground was worked over so thoroughly that the southern half of the island became, in the words of those who saw it, a cratered wasteland. And a Japanese soldier, anonymous, writing in late April 1945, in a diary later recovered by American forces, wrote exactly what the men on Guadalcanal had written 2.5 years earlier. He was surprised. He was still surprised. After all the tunnels, all the preparation, all the lessons built into the new doctrine from all the previous defeats, he looked up from his position and confided to his diary, "I am really surprised at the amount of ammunition that the enemy has. When friendly forces fire 1 round, at least 10 rounds are guaranteed to come back." 1 for 10. That was the ratio a Japanese soldier wrote down on Okinawa in 1945. That was the gap between what the imperial military could produce and what the United States of America sent to a single island. The NCO on Guadalcanal had written, "It is surprising how many shells the enemy has," in January of 1943. 30 months later and 2,000 miles away, another man wrote the same thing. Not because history repeated itself, because the machines kept producing, the ships kept arriving, the ammunition kept coming, and the sound never stopped. General Kuribayashi sent his final radio transmissions from Iwo Jima in March of 1945. On March 22nd, he reported to Imperial Headquarters, "We are still fighting. The strength under my command is now about 400. He noted that the Americans had suggested surrender through a loudspeaker. "Our officers and men," he said, just laughed and paid no attention. But his final transmission, the last message to Tokyo, was something else entirely. "We are sorry indeed," Kuribayashi wrote, "that we could not have defended the island successfully. Now I believe that the enemy will invade Japan proper from this island." He described what his men had endured: an overwhelming enemy with many tanks, exposure to indescribable bombardments. And then came the line that lands differently from every other line in this story. "I would like now to apologize to my senior and fellow officers for not being strong enough to stop the enemy invasion." He was apologizing. A general, commanding soldiers who had held an island for 36 days against one of the most intensive military assaults in the Pacific War, was apologizing. Not for their courage, he called the struggle inch by inch, and said the gods themselves would weep at the bravery of his men. He was apologizing for the outcome, for being unable to stop something that could not be stopped. The man who had spent years warning that America was the last country Japan should fight, died on that island on March 23, 1945. He was right about everything that mattered. He had been right before the war began. And General Mitsuru Ushijima, commanding the Japanese 32nd Army on Okinawa, committed suicide on June 22, 1945, as organized resistance ended. The battle had lasted 82 days. More than 110,000 Japanese defenders were killed. Come back now to the man in the trench on Christmas Day. He is not a symbol. He is not a lesson. He is a sergeant, running a fever for the 3rd time, scratching 6 words into a journal that no one from his side would ever read. During a bombardment he could not answer. He drank whiskey on New Year's Day and toasted the Emperor. He wrote about being hungry enough to dream of rice cakes. He wrote about watching electric lights come on at the enemy's captured airfield and finding it really terrible to see. His last entry described going out for food and keeping careful watch on stray bullets. Then the diary ends. What these men felt, the unnamed NCO, Ora in his dugout on New Georgia, the unknown soldier on Iwo Jima, we cannot fully know. Their inner lives belong to them, but what they wrote is documented. What they admitted is on the page. The sound of American artillery was not just a military fact to them. It was the sound of a gap they could not close, a surprise that would not diminish, a fire that kept coming when their own had gone quiet. And in the end, the most honest testimony about American strength in the Pacific did not come from American commanders. It came from the men on the other side of the guns, writing by candlelight in trenches and tunnels, confiding to notebooks that would outlive them, astonished, always, by how much the enemy had. That is why Japanese troops feared the sound of American artillery. Not because the sound was unfamiliar, because the sound never stopped. If you have been watching this channel for a while, you know we do not tell this war through the winners. We sit with the ones who lost it and ask what they saw and what they finally admitted. If that is something that matters to you, subscribe now and hit the bell so you never miss an episode. Every week we tell the war through the eyes of those who lost it. If this one moved you, leave it a like. It helps more people find us. And tell us in the comments where you are watching from tonight. We read every one. We will see you in the next one.